8 cores of Zen 2 processing power, an RDNA 2.0 ray tracing enabled GPU, and a terabyte of flash storage. No, I'm not talking about Sony's PlayStation 5. This is a gaming PC. All this power and all this performance for only... shit. I know, I said console killer month is over. That's not what this is. For one thing, from a value perspective, this ain't even close. Even at scalper prices, you can still get a PS5 for less than the price of the graphics card in this build. No, this is more of a straight-up comparison. What happens when you take the performance data from 10 PS5 enhanced titles and see how those same games run on a PC with the closest components available from retail? The premise is, admittedly, similar to my not good enough console killer video, and I'm using some of that data here too. This time though, I'm not making any compromises in performance. The PC in question has an AMD Ryzen 7 3700X cooled with a Wraithspire RGB. This 8-core CPU with simultaneous multi-threading is the closest part available to the one in the PS5. It has a base frequency of 3.6 GHz, already 100 MHz higher than the console, and will more than likely boost itself over 4 GHz most of the time. I could limit this down to the PS5's frequency, but if I'm paying over double the price of the console, I think I'm entitled to some perks. The GPU is a PowerColor Red Devil RX 6700 XT, one of the better reviewed examples of the partner cards, with a lengthy triple fan cooler and tasteful RGB lighting. My key rationale for selecting this card is that it's the closest to the PS5's GPU. It has a 4 compute unit advantage over the console, as well as about 200 MHz higher clock speeds, but there really isn't any model of card closer in theoretical performance. It also comes into stock much more frequently than the higher end parts in AMD's stack, and way more often than the GeForce cards, though, as pointed out previously, it doesn't come cheap. Mine cost me £680, about 70% higher than the reference model's alleged MSRP. I could get a PS5 digital edition delivered for about £600, but I'm not going to dwell on that too much. For storage, I'm running a Crucial P1 NVMe SSD. This 1TB drive is only PCIe 3, as opposed to the 4.0 drive in the console, but the motherboard doesn't support the higher bandwidth standard, and I'm somewhat dubious about its benefits at the moment anyway. The rest of the specs are on screen now, and the observant among you may have noticed that the PC in the B-roll is actually a PC building simulator capture from my last video. That's because I didn't have a spare case to build in, so I actually used my cardboard box test bench setup. Once more, I'm benchmarking at 4K and using PS5 equivalent settings where possible. As the Medium is an Xbox exclusive, I switched it out for the more well-known and crucially platform-agnostic Resident Evil Village. Coming from the Medium, gameplay here is a dream. Using DF's console equivalent settings with high textures, 2160 interlaced rendering and no VRS, I got an average of 87.6 FPS and lows of 67.6. If I weren't looking to match the console settings here, I'd probably go for a non-interlaced 1440 and see how far up I could drag the textures, as even at the high setting I noticed that at monitor distances some textures aren't as detailed as I'd like. After some digging on the internet, I found a forum post on Reset Era that contained what appeared to be the config file adjustments that enable the actual factual PS5 quality settings for Watch Dogs Legion. The result, while broadly in line with the console experience, is a bit disappointing. 35 FPS average is slightly higher than the console's 30, granted, but the lows of 21 are pretty painful. Now, the results are from the canned benchmark, which encapsulates some more intensive graphical effects, and I did obtain better FPS in normal gameplay, but I'd be inclined to drop the resolution further to guarantee a 30 FPS minimum. In fact, as much as I love RT, I'd prefer to turn it off and play at 60 FPS instead. Jedi Fallen Order is still awaiting its second 9th gen patch. The first PS5 update brought 1200 resolution at 60 FPS. Given that the not good enough PC actually was good enough to match the more demanding quality and performance modes of the Xbox Series X, I wasn't too afraid of how this upgraded PC would fare. Sure enough, 1440 with epic settings averages basically 100 FPS and drops only as low as about 69. Nice. As I was curious about how it compared to the Series X, I also tested at full 4K, seeing an average of 47 and lows of 39. With DRS enabled, it's actually possible to obtain a locked 4K 60, though the game still tends to stutter during cutscenes and when loading in new areas, regardless of the platform. Plus, we all know that 4K with DRS is not really 4K. Yes, I have deliberately chosen to include only games with subtitles separated by a colon, which now brings me to Assassin's Creed Valhalla. As the previous PC proved more than capable of running at PS5 equivalent settings, I decided this PC could afford to take a victory lap. Rather than limit myself to the console equivalent quality settings in order to match frame rates with the PS5's performance mode, I went with the high quality preset and resolution scaling of 80%. This resulted in an average of 71 FPS, with only the 1% lows letting the sight down slightly. In matching the 4K 30 of the console's quality mode, I was able to step up to full 4K and the Ultra preset, with averages coming in at 45 FPS and lows of 34. This time around, I'm no wiser as to what the specific enhancements are in For Honor's 9th gen patch. All I know is it's supposed to run at 4K 60 FPS, and that the PC version recently added an extreme quality setting. Putting 2 and 2 together, I assumed that the console version would in fact be using that quality setting. Sure enough, running through the first story mission in 4K at extreme quality results in an average FPS of 71 and lows of 55. It wouldn't take much quality tweaking to obtain a locked 60. Remedy were quite transparent with Digital Foundry for their video on Control's 9th gen update. Consoles run at a render resolution of 1440 with a mix of quality settings, some of which aren't directly replicable on PC. Matching them as closely as possible, but turning textures up to Ultra so my 12GB of VRAM didn't get bored, I saw an average of 40 FPS with ray tracing and 84 FPS without. More than matching the 30 and 60 FPS of the consoles, though only a 10 to 20% improvement over the not good enough PC build. testing on the older 2060 Super and weaker Ryzen 3600, I had to jump through some hoops to emulate the PS5's performance, quality and ray tracing modes in Crysis Remastered. Mercifully, with the extra horsepower in this build, I could effectively skip the performance setting. Running at 3200 by 1800 and high settings, I saw an average of 65 FPS with lows of 54. From what I saw in Digital Foundry's research, the console's quality mode doesn't stick rigidly to the 60 FPS cap either, and also is evidently using some hidden upscaling that results in lower image quality. As a result, I don't think it would be unreasonable to simply drop the PC's resolution to 1440 in order to match the locked 60 FPS of performance mode, and still obtain higher visual quality than the PS5. I tested ray tracing at 1080 high and 1440 medium, with the former pushing closer to 100 FPS and the latter only reaching 56. Depending on your personal preference, it may be possible to tweak the scaling to get a perfect balance, but I'm more inclined to recommend 1080 in this case. Either way, this is equal to or better than DF's experience running ray tracing mode on PS5. I think Codemasters must have had some seriously inconclusive results from their market research when developing Dirt 5, as it's somehow ended up with 3 quality modes: performance, quality, and resolution. This was definitely an area for improvement from my last PC build, which failed to reach any of the target frame rates, and thankfully after some experimenting I arrived at some settings I feel do the game justice. Performance mode on console is a locked 120 FPS with sacrificed image quality. I achieved this running at a render resolution of 1080 with low quality settings and ray tracing enabled, though as the game only uses RT for shadows, I feel like this might be an unnecessary extravagance. Quality mode runs at 60 FPS, mostly sub 4K resolution but with high levels of detail, so I settled for render res at 1800, ray tracing enabled, and used the high quality preset. This just scrapes over 60 FPS average, but did dip into the mid-50s, mainly when water effects were on screen. Resolution mode sticks rigidly to 4K by sacrificing detail and textures, and is, in my opinion, a pretty pointless mode, but it can be emulated at 2160 with medium settings and RT on. Given how poorly the RX 6700 XT handled Cyberpunk 2077 in the reasonably priced gaming PC, I didn't have high hopes for this test, but I need not have been worried. Unlike on that PC, the game isn't being shackled by a lowly quad-core, and thanks to the 3700X, our graphics card can really shine. I've been a bit more ambitious in emulating PS5's 1188p at 60 FPS, or 55% of 4K. With high settings enabled, this returned a very acceptable average of 75 and 1% lows of 50. I imagine using dynamic resolution scaling or rounding down to 1080 would bring those minimums up for those who can't stand dips below 60. The PlayStation versions don't have a quality mode option yet, however the Xbox does. Once again, I've aimed at the Series X's 3200 by 1800, or 83% of 4K, at 30 FPS. Once more, using the high preset, this was a huge success, averaging 36 with lows of just 29.6. I can't directly compare RT performance, as CDPR still haven't released the official 9th gen version of the game yet, but I managed to get something close to a 30 FPS experience at 50% scaling and high settings. I dare say there might be a way of obtaining closer to a locked 60, perhaps with some lower image quality settings and dynamic resolution, but rather than speculate about it, I decided I was happy enough proving that 30 FPS with ray tracing was indeed possible. The new enhanced edition of Metro Exodus is touted as the first major title to run exclusively on AMD and Nvidia ray tracing enabled hardware, which poses a challenge as this GPU is not the strongest tracer of rays, but that reliance on new tech makes this title worth investigating. I did a fair amount of digging around in the settings to find something approaching the 4K 60 the consoles were going to be targeting, and found a shading rate of 0.4, 2 times VRS, High settings with medium RT gave close to a constant 60 FPS, dipping mostly during the many cutscenes. Now, you might be thinking that a 0.4 shading rate, which is the game's terminology for resolution scaling, doesn't sound much like 4K, and you're correct, but it's not as bad as it sounds. As I write this, the console versions haven't been released, so I don't have hard data on what settings they use, but my results from 4K with a 0.4 shading rate roughly match the frame rates obtained from benchmarking at native 2560 by 1440, so I assume developers for A games are measuring their shading rate by total area instead of linearly, as 1440 is about 44% of the total pixel count of 4K. Incidentally, the best results I got from full 4K was only 44 FPS average, a long way from the target 60, and involved making some substantial compromises to quality settings. It's not going to blow anyone's minds to say this PC easily matches the PlayStation 5 in games optimised for the new hardware. This is, after all, the purpose of the build. However, the legendary console optimization struck in games like Watch Dogs Legion, where PS5 has the dubious advantage of running lower quality settings than are usually available on PC. On the flip side, updated previous gen games like Fallen Order reveal how much power is being kept in reserve. If I haven't sold this PC by then, I might revisit some titles as and when they receive further upgrades. Of course, the final issue is that of price. I deliberately didn't call this a console killer. I paid about £500 more than the current scalper price of a PS5 digital edition, and if your only purpose is gaming, then this really isn't £500 better than the console. Can I see a time where this is closer to a console killer price? See my video linked on screen for my thoughts on that particular subject. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.